them underneath the altar, and when people wanted to eat with the martyrs, they came forward and ate the Eucharist.
Meals in tombs became rituals at altars. Then in 313, Emperor Constantine, supposedly after a vision of a cross, made Christianity legal throughout his empire, and the era of Christian temple construction began. But under these stone temples lies the oldest known church in Rome, dating from the early years of the 4th century. It's a relic from the last days of a religious movement that had no use for monumental architecture. For Jesus, the simple act of breaking bread was all it took to be holy. For the first Christians, it was all they needed to topple the mightiest of empires. On one fateful night, a piece of bread and a cup of wine became the symbols of a man's life and foreshadowed his death. Now we go in search of the real Last Supper. Rebuild its true setting, sample the menu, probe the scriptures to discover the true guest list, and reconstruct first-century Jewish rituals to reveal the truth about the Holy Grail that Da Vinci never knew. One spring day around 30 AD, as the sun set over Jerusalem, a group of peasants got together to eat a meal. One man took a piece of bread, broke it, and said these simple words.
Take, this is my body.
Then he passed a cup of wine.
Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood.
What that man did that night will never fade into obscurity. Because the next day, he was dead on the cross. "2,000 years on, churches around the world still reenact Jesus' Last Supper. It happens thousands of times every single day. The ritual is the Eucharist, or Holy Communion.
The wine that is shared symbolizes the blood, which is spilled for the sake of humanity's sins. And the bread symbolizes Jesus' body broken on the cross.
Many artists painted their visions of that fateful supper when Jesus predicted his death. One of these paintings is more famous than all the others. An artist created it in the 1490s in northern Italy. His name was Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci chose to freeze the moment when Jesus tells his disciples one of them will betray him.
It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread.
Da Vinci's vision of this electrifying instant between Judas and Jesus was so powerful that it became the way we all imagine the Last Supper. Jesus at the center, flanked by 12 well-dressed men, a table covered with a fine cloth, glasses of wine, loaves of bread, plates and knives. Da Vinci's Last Supper is also famous for what it does not show. An object that almost every other medieval and Renaissance painting of the Last Supper makes its focus: the cup. Crusaders turned the vessel that symbolically held Jesus' blood into a legend. The quest for that Holy Grail incited centuries of bloodshed.
Most of the depictions from the Renaissance and medieval period show the Holy Grail as gold or silver and jewel encrusted. It's beautiful and ornate. And I think people imagine that because Jesus, in a way, founded Christianity at the Last Supper, that it has to be a beautiful artifact.
No crusaders ever found the Holy Grail. Perhaps that was because they were looking for the wrong thing.
Well, it's obvious that the Holy Grail legend came into being in the Middle Ages, so perhaps it's appropriate that the Grail looks like a fancy medieval cup, and similar to cups that were used in churches, which come from that period. But of course, it has absolutely no relation to anything that would have happened in ancient times.
The Holy Grail is not the only detail Last Supper artists got wrong. The Bible says the meal happened at night, but Da Vinci and other painters said it in daylight. Da Vinci's Jesus has long hair and is clean-shaven. Other paintings from the late 15th century show that was simply the fashion of the day.
What Da Vinci's doing when he paints the Last Supper is that he's painting Jesus as a Renaissance Christian and not as a first century Jew.
Older artwork shows Jesus closer to the way he probably looked, with short cropped hair and a beard.
But I think Da Vinci got an awful lot of it wrong.
We're about to take a fresh look at Jesus' final meal. To understand why the simple act of sharing bread and passing wine became the core ritual of the church, we will do what Da Vinci never did. Return to Jerusalem. Examine ancient dining rooms. Search for clues to first century cooking. And explore the meeting of food and religion.
You see that he's got a bowl with the wine in it. He's now going to pronounce the blessing over the wine.
To discover what Jesus really did at the Last Supper and what the real Holy Grail might have looked like. We have to see the Holy Land the way Jesus did.
I don't think that Jesus, during what we call the Last Supper, was thinking, I'm going to institutionalize a ritual here that people will observe for hundreds and maybe even thousands of years.
To tell the real story of history's most famous meal, we need to understand when and where it took place. Jesus grew up in Nazareth and began his ministry preaching and healing in the villages of Galilee. But just days before he died, Jesus made the fateful decision to travel to Jerusalem.
The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem.
I don't think Jesus left Galilee because he felt like his work was done there. I think he goes to Jerusalem because Jerusalem is the place of God's presence, it's the place of the temple.
Jerusalem was the center of the Jewish universe, and each spring at Passover, hundreds of thousands of Jews made a pilgrimage there. The Passover commemorated the Jews' escape from slavery in Egypt. According to the Old Testament, God sent a wave of plagues to ravage Egypt. But he told the Jews that if they sacrificed a lamb and painted their doorposts with its blood, his plagues would pass over their homes and allow them to escape. In Jesus' time, Jews brought year-old lambs to the temple in Jerusalem to repeat the same blood sacrifice their ancestors had made.
The blood was, of course, not put on the doorpost. It was now spilled at the base of the altar, because that was what made a sacrifice work in biblical law.
On the day before the first night of Passover, butcher priests killed countless thousands of lambs. And burnt a piece of each of them on the sacrificial fire.
The priests shall dash its blood against all sides of the altar and turn it into smoke on the altar.
The temple would have been awash with blood. The Gospels don't tell us whether Jesus offered a lamb sacrifice in the temple, but they suggest that Jesus' own death was looming in his mind as the Passover feast approached.
He said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer.
Jesus had a reputation for being a provocative teacher. And when he brought his message to the heart of Judaism, the Gospels say he sensed trouble ahead.
Jesus speaks of Jerusalem as the city that kills the prophets. He even says, how can it be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem?
Jews came to Jerusalem at Passover to celebrate their freedom from bondage, at a time when they were no longer free. The Roman army occupied the land, and the city was thick with tension.
Probably the majority of the Jewish population would have been very hostile toward Rome, resentful of all the economic changes that Roman imperial control had brought.
First-century Passover festivals frequently ended in fatal clashes between Roman troops and Jewish pilgrims. And this year, it was Jesus who would end up dead. 3 Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, say that the Last Supper took place on the night of the Passover feast. Historians have reconstructed how Jews used to celebrate that meal. After the sacrifice, the head of each household brought the meat back home for the Passover feast.
The central act of the Passover ritual was the eating of the actual portion of the Paschal lamb. About 10 people, maybe it would stretch up to 20 people for each lamb.
Jews prepared 2 other foods to eat with the lamb: bitter herbs to recall the bitter taste of slavery, unleavened bread, a hard cracker baked without yeast, an echo of the bread that did not have time to rise in the hurried departure out of Egypt. At the meal, parents recited the story of Exodus to their children so they would never forget their bond with God.
You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt.
But if the Last Supper was a Passover meal, and if lamb was the key item on the menu, why did the Gospel writers mention just bread and wine? And a close look at Da Vinci's crumbling fresco shows he chose a different entree, one that we find in other earlier depictions: fish. The questions about Jesus' final meal keep piling up. To find answers, we're going to have to travel back to first-century Jerusalem, fight our way through the crowds of pilgrims to discover where Jesus broke bread for the last time. The first step to unlocking the mystery that swirls around the Last Supper is to find out where it took place. Modern Jerusalem is filled with holy sites commemorating the last days of Jesus. The Via Dolorosa marks the route where Jesus carried his cross. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre houses shrines to the crucifixion and Jesus' burial. There's also a memorial to the place where, the night before he was killed, he shared a meal with his closest companions.
Everything that he did, everything that he said had to happen somewhere, and you had to know where those places were and identify it.
The Bible gives us only the briefest description of the Last Supper's location. Jesus sends some of his disciples into Jerusalem to meet a man who he says will have a room prepared for them.
He will show you a large room upstairs, already furnished.
Today, tour guides show pilgrims to a 2-story building on Mount Zion, less than a mile southwest of the Temple Mount.
We're on Mount Zion, and we're looking behind me at the Koinaculum. Among Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem, this is the place.
Archaeologist Peter Richardson has studied the architecture and city planning of ancient Jerusalem. He knows that Franciscan monks built the upper floor here 1,400 years after Jesus.
I'm not sure that all the tour guides make clear that this is a much later space.
But like all good legends, this one might be founded on a grain of truth. Further down the western slope of Mount Zion, just a short walk from the medieval Koinaculum, lie the remains of ordinary homes from the 1st century.
This is a group of first-century houses in Jerusalem. Nowadays, it's outside the walls of the city of Jerusalem, but in the first century, it was actually enclosed within the walls.
The houses in this part of the city were small. The lower classes lived here. It was also about as far away from the hustle and bustle of temple activity as you could get.
Jerusalem at the time of Passover would have had its population increase by probably tenfold. In other words, it goes from perhaps 60,000 to 600,000 with pilgrims flowing into the city. And they need places to stay, they need places to eat the Passover meal.
This was a neighborhood where outsiders like Jesus and his band of poor Galileans would have stood a fighting chance of securing space to eat the Passover.
I'm walking along a rather rudimentary lane that gives access to this house. This is the doorway to the house.
The footprints of these houses are tiny. Poor Jerusalemites built them right next door to one another. There was little light inside, so the roof, accessed by an outside stairway, was a natural place for residents to work and live.
The roof, of course, was used in antiquity as an extension of the living space for a variety of functions. Women would use it for spinning and weaving. It might be used for large family meals, communal meals of one kind or another.
Outdoor areas were important under normal circumstances, but during the crowded Passover season, the rooftop was the only available space for pilgrims to celebrate the holiday meal.
People put up various types of structures on rooftops, in streets, anywhere they could, so as to accommodate this massive number of people who had come to celebrate the Passover.
An improvised rooftop setting is not what comes to mind for an event as monumental as the Last Supper, but this is the best fit to biblical and historical evidence. Biblical historian Lawrence Schiffman helps archaeologist Jonathan Reed fine-tune the details of a temporary Passover dining room.
Okay, and palms like this or thatch, what do you think?
I think a lot of people had like rooftop shades on their houses and could very well have had these available all the time. Probably they would have the tables in the middle somehow.
The Gospels themselves say that the Last Supper took place in an upper room. And I envision that to mean a room that's temporary, that's created for pilgrims up on a rooftop, not a permanent dining hall, and certainly nothing elegant and ornate.
Da Vinci and other Renaissance painters showed Jesus and his 12 disciples sitting at a table in a grand hall. That detail is not only unlikely in overcrowded Jerusalem, it's also completely inaccurate for a first-century meal. The proof lies over 600 miles away in the ancient city of Ephesus in Turkey. Ephesus was a flourishing Roman colonial city from the 1st to the 4th century. Here are some of the best preserved examples of 1st century homes built in the Greek and Roman style. We can still see the exquisite interior design. And we can also find important clues to how the wealthy ate 2,000 years ago.
This is the dining room in the house. You can see the mosaic pattern on the floor. It's only decorated in the central section here. The reason for that is that this is the only part of the floor that you would actually see because these areas are covered with benches.
The three-sided couch that once filled the room was probably wooden and has long since rotted away. Wealthy Greeks and Romans always laid down to eat. Servants brought food to them on low central tables. All the diners reclined on their left sides, leaving the right hand free for eating. The gospel writers who wrote in Greek say that Jesus also reclined at meals.
Okay, and the setup, what do you think? A couple of tables here, and then the cushions sort of spread around?
The cushions have got to be arranged around the sides so that the people could lean more or less towards the tables.
Fitting over a dozen people onto the rooftop of a small house does not leave much room for the food.
This is a shared meal where everyone's eating out of one pot and dipping their bread in.
These were not the richest people.
The Gospels describe Jesus and the other reclining diners dipping into the same bowl at the Last Supper.
He said to them, "It is one of the 12. one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me.
But what food was in those bowls? 3 Gospels say that Jesus' Last Supper was the lamb feast held on the first night of Passover.
And they prepared the Passover meal.
But one Gospel says it happened the night before.
Now before the festival of the Passover, during supper.
Finding out which version is correct not only affects the menu, it also could change the guest list and the entire meaning of the Last Supper. A 1,000 years of art gave us one window on the Last Supper. Historical and archaeological research has now given us another.
The art of the Last Supper is rather comical when you think about it. The 12 disciples and Jesus all sitting on one side of the table. Well, of course it couldn't have happened that way, and the only reason it's portrayed that way is that's the only way the artist can get all the faces in the picture.
Jesus and his disciples would most likely have been sitting on a rooftop under a temporary awning. They were probably in a poorer neighborhood in a Jerusalem that teemed with Passover pilgrims. 3 Gospels say the meal was the Passover feast, what Jews today call a Seder. But the Gospel's guest list conflicts with Jewish law.
When it was evening, he came with the 12.
The 12 disciples eating with Jesus would be totally abnormal if it was a real Seder. A real Passover Seder was eaten with the family. It in fact says in the Torah that each person should eat it with his family, men, women, and children.
The fact that the Bible does not mention women and children doesn't mean they were not there.
It's reasonable to imagine that some of the women followers of Jesus were at the Last Supper. The texts do not say only the 12 were there.
Jesus had traveled to Jerusalem with his closest followers, and we know there were women in that group.
I certainly would include among them Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus. We know that because they're very prominent at the crucifixion and at the tomb. There's no way, in my mind, that Jesus would have excluded them from the Last Supper.
If the Last Supper was, in fact, a Passover meal, then Jesus and his core group, the people he thought of as family, would have gathered on the rooftop at sunset. A temporary canopy, perhaps made of palm fronds, would have protected them. And they would have sat on cushions on the floor. Archaeology helped us reconstruct the venue. Now it can help us recreate the menu.
They shall eat the lamb, roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs.
In northern Israel, amid the ruins of the Galilean town of Yodaphat, archaeologist Mordechai Aviam has dug up evidence of how the lower class would have made the Passover meal 1,000 years after the custom began. Stone mills like this once ground wheat grown in the nearby fields. Aviam discovered remains of beehive-shaped ovens called taboons.
The fire was inside the ovens, or what we call taboons, made of clay, and this is the place to bake the bread.
Middle Eastern bread was then, as it is now, a flat, round pita bread. But at Passover, Jews made bread without yeast, in memory of the bread that did not have time to rise when their ancestors fled from Egypt. In fact, it was the custom to sweep houses clean of any trace of yeast before the Passover week began. The result was a hard cracker called matzah. It's a far cry from the round loaves of bread Da Vinci shows in his version of the Last Supper. Dr. Aviam also found fragments of the cooking pots they used in Jesus' time.
This is a rim of a cooking pot from the 1st century.
The Mishnah, a 2nd century book of Jewish laws, says that besides roast lamb and bitter green herbs, There may have been one more item on the Passover menu, a sweet dip made from stewed fruit, most likely figs, which grew all over the region. This was the Passover food Jesus must have eaten throughout his life. These were the bowls he would have eaten it from. After sunset on the 14th day of the month of Nisan, which falls between March and April, Jews all over Judea and Galilee, rich or poor, would settle down to a sacred ritual.
And you see that first everybody has put their shawls over their heads to cover their heads in reverence.
The Passover always began with the head of the household saying a blessing over the wine.
You see that he's got a bowl with the wine in it, and he's now serving everybody out of that a cup of wine, and he's now going to pronounce the blessing over the wine. Everybody will take a sip of it.
Next came the blessing of the bread.
Then the father takes the bread, which is unleavened bread for the Passover meal, and passes it around to everyone. So they take a piece, and once everybody has a piece of the bread, he then pronounces the blessing over it, and they all eat some of it.
After these blessings, it was time for the feast.
And then you would proceed to the main meal, which was the Paschal lamb, the matzah, and the bitter herbs. And that would have been the menu.
For many poor Jews, this might be the only taste of meat they would get all year. The Passover feast was supposed to last all night, with stories retold about the Exodus from Egypt. But the details are now lost to history.
We don't know what extra blessings or prayers or hymns or songs they might have sung at the meal. Presumably they had some.
The women who lived in the house below Jesus' Last Supper would have served these same foods. And they would have expected the diners to follow the same time-honored rituals. If the Last Supper really was a Passover feast. The Gospel of John stands apart from the other accounts by saying the meal took place the day before Passover. There are solid historical reasons to side with John's version. The order of the blessing in the Last Supper was first bread, then wine. That's the opposite of the rules for Passover.
At a Sabbath meal or festival meal, and this would include the Passover meal, one would have to begin with the blessing of the wine. And in fact, this is one of the biggest arguments against the Last Supper being a Passover.
Another problem is the single cup that Jesus shares with his companions. At Passover, all were supposed to drink from their own cups. It's an area where Da Vinci actually gets Jewish history correct, if perhaps only by chance. It could be that the gospel writers, who worked at least 40 years after Jesus died, simply weren't sure which night the meal took place.
To my mind, the historical truth, which can be sort of noticed in the absence of Passover details in the actual Last Supper accounts, is that the thing happened a few days before. It was around Passover. The Jews were all in Jerusalem for Passover, but not actually either a Passover meal or a meal taking place the night before Passover.
There is one clue in the Old Testament that might solve the unusual order of breaking bread first, then sharing wine. It's a passage about people who are spurned by God not being mourned after they die.
No one shall break bread for the mourner, to offer comfort for the dead, nor shall anyone give them the cup of consolation to drink.
The order of bread and wine in the traditional Jewish meal of remembrance for the dead does match the Last Supper. And for a man the gospel writers knew was going to die the next day, it was a fitting description of his last meal. But what of that legendary cup that passed from lip to lip? We're about to go on a quest for the Holy Grail. Where crusaders failed, modern archaeologists think they have the answer. No relic in Christianity has inspired passion like the cup Jesus passed to his disciples on the last night of his life.
He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many."
This was the founding activity of Christianity. And so maybe people are looking for the founding implement, the thing that got it all started.
Legend has it that the Holy Grail later caught the blood of Jesus when he hung on the cross. Crusaders ransacked Jerusalem in hopes of seizing that divine chalice, be it silver or gold or encrusted with jewels. But they never found anything. Now it's the turn of archaeologists. They've unearthed countless artifacts from first-century Jewish kitchens.
I think the way in which I or most archaeologists would go about trying to figure out what the Holy Grail is like is we'd simply try to look at what would have been the most common kinds of cups that a Jewish peasant from the Galilee would have used in a Passover meal.
In all likelihood, the Holy Grail would have been something simple, something that would not look out of place on a peasant's table. Simple clay pottery cups were everywhere in first-century Judea and Galilee.
A cup passing from mouth to mouth in the Last Supper, in my opinion, most likely would have been made out of pottery. Poor Jews, like Jesus, would have been able to afford the sort of less expensive, undecorated pottery dishes.
A plain cup of fired clay is a strong contender for the Holy Grail. But there's another possibility. In the ruins of the first-century Galilean town of Yodophat, close to where Jesus grew up, archaeologist Mordechai Aviam found fragments of some very different vessels, cut straight from bedrock.
What we have here is a stone cup, two parts, the base of a stone cup and the side, including the rim.
The markings on the cup tell us how a Jewish stonemason worked this piece 2,000 years ago.
We can see that they were made of chalk, which is soft enough to cut and strong enough to hold. And we can still see the marks of the knife that cut the outside of the vessel.
This find is just the tip of the iceberg. Archaeologists have found stone vessels in every place they have dug into first-century Jewish settlements.
They became preferred among large sectors of the Jewish population, and we know this because we have many stone vessels that have been found at archaeological sites throughout the country dating to the time of Jesus.
In fact, there is even evidence of stone vessel factories just a few miles outside Jerusalem. These limestone cylinders are proof that workers here used a lathe, a rotating cutting tool, to work stone. The stone lathe was primitive. One person turned a wheel, while another held a sharp tool against the soft limestone to shape it into cups and vases.
What we have is cores that have survived from some of these cups, and it's those cores that show the lathe marks, so we know they were working with a lathe.
Archaeologist Jonathan Reed and reconstruction expert Kim Hicks are recreating stone cups using these same first-century methods.
So this is how those stone vessels are made on a lathe like this.
Yes, he's doing the roughing operation right now, taking it down to a cylindrical form to get the balance right so it doesn't wobble so much.
Yeah, powered by one person. And this is the first step here. He's just shaving it down.
But why there was an explosion of stone vessels around the time of Jesus is a mystery. One theory is that it was a byproduct of the greatest archaeological feat of ancient Jerusalem, King Herod's temple, a building the size of 7 football fields. It was so vast a project that even after the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD, its 3-story high foundation survived, and Jews revere it to this day. Artisans had to develop better methods of cutting stone to keep up with the demands of the job. But stone vessels were popular for other reasons too. According to Jewish law, contact with blood, bodily secretions, or even lizards made you unclean in the eyes of God. And if you touched any food or any bowl that contained food, you transmitted your impurity to it.
If you have a pottery vessel or a glass vessel and something impure comes into contact with it, you can't clean it. It has to be disposed of.
But a vessel cut from stone kept anything in it ritually clean.
The fact that it comes right from the natural rock from which it's been hewn out, that makes it not susceptible to impurity, because as long as the thing is in its natural state, it never becomes susceptible.
And to some historians, it's more than coincidence that the popularity of these vessels boomed at the time when the Roman Empire had conquered Judea.
As Rome is encroaching, Rome is bringing with it certain dining habits. And Jews are beginning to develop their own particular way of eating that keeps them distinct from Roman.
Stone vessels might have been a form of passive resistance against foreign domination. In Jerusalem around Passover, both Rome and ritual impurity was on everyone's minds. You could not enter the house of God if you were ritually unclean, and almost every peasant was. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims would have just purified themselves in a special ritual bath outside the temple. And at a time that was supposed to be a celebration of escape from slavery in Egypt, there was the reality of Roman soldiers in the streets outside the temple.
A lot of Jews went to the Passover ceremony mindful that even though Passover celebrated their freedom, they were in some ways being dominated.
This was the Jerusalem that Jesus and his followers overlooked as they sat down on a rooftop to dine together for the final time. Archaeologist Jonathan Reed feels certain a stone cup would have been on that roof. But what might it have looked like?
Well, here are all the items that have been produced between our lathe and hand carving operations.
These are, of course, the nicer, totally lathe-turned vessels. These here might be a little too nice, so I have a feeling that Jesus might have used probably something totally hand-carved, like this here, or maybe a bit smaller.
So which is more likely, Jonathan?
I think this would be probably the likeliest candidate, something like this.
Then that, in fact, might have been the Holy Grail itself.
Something like this could be it.
This is the best archaeological guess at how Jesus' Last Supper may have looked. A rooftop covered with palm fronds. Jesus and his disciples sitting on the floor, dipping into common bowls. And a hand-carved limestone cup passed from lip to lip.
I think that's the kind of thing that the family who's hosting Jesus at Passover would have put up on the roof for them. They know he's a big shot coming to town. They value the fact that he's staying with them. And they would have put at his disposal the best that they would have had available. And I think that would have been stone cups.
The fact that the legendary Holy Grail was a simple cup made of stone or perhaps clay explains why no crusader could ever find it.
Did Jesus drink out of something at the Last Supper, or did his followers? Of course. But I don't think from the beginning they thought, oh, this is the Holy Grail. I don't think anybody thought to preserve that cup.
The actual cup most likely lies buried with the fragments of so many other ordinary artifacts somewhere under Jerusalem. The Grail is gone, so is the wine and the bread. The gospel writers made them symbols of the new church, but the people who knew Jesus may have remembered the Last Supper for a different reason, because it may have been the way Jesus shared meals that got him killed. Today, we can only glimpse the Last Supper like vivid scenes from a half-forgotten dream.
Take, this is my body. Drink, for this is my blood.
The words Jesus spoke have become immortal, but the rest of the meal faded into history. The real Last Supper may have been a Passover meal of lamb and hard unleavened bread, but we can't be certain. Chances are it took place in a makeshift setting on a rooftop in Jerusalem during Passover week. There would have been conversation, perhaps even the singing of songs. But the gospel writers omit these details. Their focus is on one single act, Jesus passing the cup of wine.
This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood.
Today, we understand the link between wine and blood simply on the basis of color. But to a first-century Jew, the symbolism would have been far more powerful. The cup of red wine matched the cup of the Passover lamb's blood that Jews had seen dashed against the temple altar.
It becomes very clear to them that Jesus' blood in the cup is just like the blood being sacrificed from a lamb.
For the Jews, the annual slaughter of lambs kept up their end of an agreement with God who had saved them from slavery. It was their special covenant. But by the time of Luke's gospel, around 80 AD, the Romans had destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. Blood sacrifices had come to an end, and the gospel writer was asking converts to seal a new, different covenant with God.
What Christianity does is it transforms that and makes a new deal with God. That is to say, instead of Passover, you now have the Lord's Supper and Jesus' sacrifice, which connects God and the church, no longer Judaism and God.
The Last Supper has become a symbolic meal, but to Jesus, the bread and wine were very real.
I don't know that Jesus himself chose to share bread and wine because he was thinking body and blood, but he certainly was thinking the basic physical subsistence of life.
In rural Galilee, where Jesus began his ministry, peasants struggled to feed themselves.
What Jesus is seeing in Galilee, what every peasant is seeing in Galilee in the first century, is that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer.
Roman domination brought crippling taxes and had forced many farmers off their land.
For Jesus, as well as for the Jewish tradition generally, the land belonged to God. And what was happening under Roman control put Jesus as a spokesperson of this Jewish tradition on a direct collision course with the Roman Empire.
In the gospel account of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus finds himself with a hungry crowd out in the wilds of Galilee. The disciples point out that with only 5 loaves and 2 fish, they can't feed everyone. But Jesus miraculously multiplies the loaves and fishes. And the disciples have enough food to distribute to the people. You don't have to believe in the miracle to understand its message.
Food in that world is really about justice, because the reason people did not have enough food was because of the systemic injustice of the economic system.
The gospel writers use 3 important words in telling this story.
Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples.
The same words, took, broke, and gave, crop up again at the Last Supper.
Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to the disciples.
Throughout his ministry, Jesus used food to pass along his idea of a just world.
Take the bread, break the bread, and give the bread. And that's really indicative of what the kingdom of God is all about, which is to take that which belongs to God, the bread, and to distribute it to all of the people.
For Jesus, sitting down to a meal with others embodied his idea of how people should treat one another. But the Gospels tell us that the way he chose to eat offended many people of that time.
His opponents criticize his meal practice more than anything else about him.
The the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, 'Look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.'"
That's kind of name-calling in the first century. It means that he is perceived to eat with marginalized people, virtual untouchables or outcasts.
Jesus' dining habits may even have hastened his own death.
Nobody would have minded charity, but the meal practice of Jesus embodies Jesus' vision of the kingdom of God, a very different way of putting society together.
This is the picture of the Last Supper we have lived with for over 500 years. Jesus and his 12 male disciples had a stately meal, but this is not the way it was.
I think if Jesus saw Da Vinci's painting, he would be shocked. And it wouldn't be about the utensils or the bread or reclining or not, but it would have been about the fact that there's only 12 there and they're all men. I think Jesus would expect a painting in which you would have diversity, rich and poor, male and female, all together at the table.
Our archaeological investigation of the Last Supper has turned the table on Da Vinci. We've shown that the setting was a humble one, probably improvised on a rooftop. We can be almost certain that Jesus would have brought men and women to the table with him. That the Holy Grail was not some fine bejeweled chalice, but a simple stone cup. And that the ritual that became the sharing of blood and body began as a simple sharing of bread and wine for people who did not have enough to eat.